Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Today we are doing almost a different type of speaker event, one a little less book-oriented and more pictorial, but with a lot of history underpinnings. Our speaker today is Kevin Hymel. He's a historian for the U.S. Air Force Chief of Chaplain's Office. He's also the author of Pattons Photographs and Patton, Legendary World War II Commander. He holds a master's degree in American history from Villanova University, and he's a former historian for the U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth. Kevin has been a guide with the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, and he's appeared on the History Channel, the Fox News Channel, and C-SPAN. He's very entertaining, as you will soon find out. And his present book, Pattons War, examines Patton's experiences during World War II. Kevin,
thank you.
Thank you,
Dr. Mahan. All right. Hey, everybody. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mahan, for that nice introduction. That last book is in the works right now, Pattons War, so don't look on Amazon just yet. Some people I want to thank before I get started. First, Mike Rhea, my contract boss. Mike, if you want to stand up for a sec. Mike read an article I wrote in 1997 on General Pershing in the Spanish-American War and thought this guy would be great to write about chaplains. We have a few representatives of the Air Force Chaplain Corps. Guys, if you could stand up for a quick sec. Thank you. Appreciate everything you guys have done for me. The Chaplain Corps, I've worked for the military for about 20 years, and the Chaplain Corps, there's a whole different sort of language and attitude that you find. One example is one morning I bike into work and I told Chaplain Mansberger that I was biking in and a car came up behind me and then pulled around to my left and then took a right turn and I had to really kind of dodge it. And he said, well, you know, Kevin, somebody was looking over your shoulder. And I said, yeah, the jerk in the car. And then I realized what he was talking about and I said, yeah, you're right, sir. So with that, I'll tell you that in 1996, I was researching a paper for the Society of Military History that I was going to present about the day MacArthur met Patton in World War I. And I was in the Library of Congress doing research, and I came across in the Patton file something called Pattons Photographs, and I didn't know what that meant. So I accessed the index, I ordered them, and I got a bunch of about coffee table-sized books full of photographs and captions, handwritten. And I was going through them, and I realized I had never seen any of these photographs before. And then it dawned on me, these were the pictures that Patton took with his own camera. I wrote an article about it. I brought it to Martin Blumenson, a very well-known Patton historian. And when he gave it back to me, I said, Martin, did you learn anything new about Patton that you didn't know before? And he said, yeah, I didn't know he had a photo collection. So right then I knew I was onto something new. And so there were 11 of these photo albums. So I selected what I thought were the most important photographs or the most revealing, put them together in this book, went through all of Patton's diaries and letters. And it was just an amazing find because every historian, whenever you write, you're always trying to get into the head of the person you're writing about. And here we get to see what this person saw and thought was important. And as I was doing this, I thought, God, what if George Washington or Robert E. Lee or Ulysses S. Grant had a camera with them and we could see what they saw and thought was important? So fortunately, General Patton did, and so I'll share with you some of his photographs and what he was thinking and what he thought was important. So if you go to the first slide. So this is November 8th, 1942. This is the landings of Operation Torch in North Africa. Patton commanded the Western Task Force that landed in Morocco, specifically Fadala Beach. And you can see his pants are soaking wet from coming up the shore. He actually helped push a landing craft back out into the water that was stuck on a sandbar. And he sent this photograph to his wife. And this kind of gives you a good idea of what Patton's mind is like. So this is the first day of combat, November 8th, 1942. Sends this picture to his wife and says, hey, this picture will make a great magazine cover. So day one, he's already got himself on the cover of Life magazine. You'll notice he's got the two ivory-handled pistols, not pearl. And when in 1915, he launched an attack on a ranch to capture a bandito, General Cardenas. And a gunfight ensued, and Patton actually had to stop and reload in the middle of this gun battle. He said that the dust of the adobe hut where the bullets were hitting above him was raining down on him, and he swore he would never be stuck in battle with one pistol. So he started wearing two at all times. Now, by the time he invades Europe, he's going to stop this habit. And it's not because he's far away from the action. It's because he said they were just too darn heavy. So he didn't use the word darn, though. So with the invasion at Fadala Beach, the troops move inland. They surround Casablanca. It's a 3-day campaign. Patton's getting ready to attack, and the French surrender. So he actually occupies a Shell Oil building that still exists today, and it still has the Shell Oil symbols on the sides. And he went up to the 3rd floor and snapped this photograph of the 3rd Infantry Division coming ashore, coming into the city. And he said this was a great birthday present. His birthday was November 11th, 1885. And so he captured Casablanca on his birthday. Quick note about coming ashore I forgot about, and this isn't in very many history books, but when he came ashore, the battle had already moved on. And so he said there were guys in foxholes on the beach, there was equipment sitting around, and there was an Arab coming up the beach with a donkey, and he was throwing American equipment onto its back. And he picks up an M1 rifle and is getting ready to put it in the shoal, with the donkey. And Patton sees this, and he realizes he has to act quick, so he actually pulls out his pistol and fires a shot past the head of this guy. The guy drops the rifle, runs off. So that's the first shot fired by Patton in World War II. While Patton is in Morocco, he's basically sitting out the war. The war is going on in Tunisia, about 100 miles away. He's spending his time fishing, hunting, inspecting troops, and he's bored out of his mind. Fortunately, Eisenhower sends him to do an inspection of the Tunisian front. And the first soldier he comes across is his son-in-law, John Waters. He said John looked tired. He had a bullet hole in his jacket. Other than that, he was doing fine. He was a battalion commander in the 1st Armored Division. About 2 weeks after this photo is taken, John is going to be captured by the Germans during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and is going to spend the rest of the war in a POW camp. This is going to become a little bit of an obsession with Patton. He really traces John's movements at all times. He visits the spot where he was captured and picks up an ammo clip and mails it to his daughter. His daughter was named Beatrice, just like his wife. It was his oldest daughter. And it's always been a big question, because he eventually launches a rescue attempt to get John out of a German POW camp. And the question was, did he do it to get John out, or did he do it to save the prisoners? And I found a September 1944 issue of Stars and Stripes, and there's a front page article, Patton's daughter hopes he rescues her husband. So this is September of 44 for something he does in 45. I thought the evidence was pretty clear. This is Patton's aide, Dick Jensen. Patton was very close to Dick, and he is killed on April 1st. If you've seen the movie Patton, he's killed visiting Bradley, and Bradley says, put him in my car. The story that Patton wrote about, and Bradley and Bradley's assistant all said that Dick Jensen was away visiting something called Benson Force, an armored force designed to break through the German lines. When this airplane attack occurs, the Luftwaffe comes in, bombs, and kills him. I actually found at the Army War College in Pennsylvania a first-hand account of one of Patton's staffers named Cohen, and he wrote that all of this was a big cover-up and a big lie. What actually happened on April 1st was Patton moved his headquarters closer to the front, despite Eisenhower specifically ordering him. He wanted a corps commander, not a casualty, that Patton was not to get up too close to the front. And he moves his headquarters to an area on the west side of a ridge, and he orders his private Cohen to run up the ridge and see if he can see any Germans on the other side. Well, Cohen takes off, and minutes later an artillery barrage comes in. And so he screams for Cohen to come back. Cohen comes running down, and Patton says, "You idiot, the Germans saw you on top of that hill and they shelled us." And he said, "No, sir, I only made it halfway up. The Germans have the top of the ridge." And Patton didn't believe him. And about 2 hours later, a raid of German bombers came in. This soldier Cohen jumped into Patton's scout car, fired at some of the planes, knocked one of them down. Patton said he was going to get him a Silver Star for that. But then he said there was one round that came in very close and it shook the car, and that was the slit trench where Dick Jensen was holding out. And he said Patton was so shook up that Bradley actually had to help him into his car. Cohen helped some of the other soldiers carry Dick Jensen's body out of the area. And he said, this sounds like a fantastical story. So he actually wrote to Bradley's aide and said, hey, his name was Chet Hansen. He said, I remember it this way. Do you remember it? And while he wouldn't agree that Patton was there, he did agree that he said, yeah, I remember you being there and helping us carry the body. I published this as an article in Army History about 2 years ago saying, if anybody else has a different story, please let me know. And I've never heard anything back. And what struck me was I was trying to build the evidence for this guy's argument, and then I realized I actually have some evidence on me. So this is actually a picture that Patton took. And this is the slit trench, and this is the shell hole from the bomb. This is Al Stiller, one of Patton's staff members. So Patton snapped this photograph. He does not say anywhere in his diaries or letters that he ever visited the spot where Dick was killed. He said he visited his grave about 3 or 4 times. But here in the middle of the photo album was this photograph that I know Patton took. So to me, that's another piece of evidence in the trail. By the way, Al Stiller, this is a very common habit of Patton's, that he would have a lot of his staffers stand in photographs, not because he liked them or anything, but to give perspective. And so, there's going to be no more in this presentation, but there's a lot in the book of Patton having soldiers stand in areas. As the battle in North Africa is wrapping up, Patton passes through a town, and he sees this archway, and it's called Trajan's Arch. And Trajan was a Roman emperor about 100 A.D. So Patton stands here, has his photograph taken, and he wrote underneath it, Trajan's Arch, Old Conqueror and New. So he's got himself up there with the Roman conquerors now, much more advanced than just Life magazine cover. The invasion of Sicily. So Patton's force is going to be upgraded from a corps to what's called the 7th Army, and lands in the south at Gela Beach. And Lucien Truscott is one of his new division commanders. Truscott had been the assistant commander for the 3rd Infantry Division. The commander, Anderson, suffered some battle fatigue, so Truscott gets the promotion, and he presents Patton with a Italian army flag. And so there's Patton and Truscott holding it up. You can see this thumbprint right here. It gives you an idea. That's how small the picture was. A lot of these are just postage-size stamps almost. Next photo. This is really interesting. This shows Patton was not only interested in taking photographs of history and people that he knew, but if you'll notice, there's an arrow here at the top and here at the bottom. Patton took this picture and mailed this to soldiers at Aberdeen Proving Grounds saying, look, the Germans are adding more plate armor to their turrets and to their machine guns. We need to do the same. So his photography actually had sort of a pragmatic element to it, that he's using it as a tool, not just as a record for his journeys and battles. Patton called this a good German. He took a lot of photographs of dead Germans. He would call them good Germans or good Huns. He took so many that after a while, he just in his photo albums would write GG for good German. And he commented that a lot of the Germans would booby trap their troops with a hand grenade under the arm. And he said it became such a problem that our troops took less prisoners than possible, which means they were shooting Germans instead of taking them prisoner because of tricks like this. This is Palermo in the northern section of Sicily. This is a major objective for Patton because this will split the island in half. It had been bombed, but when Patton got close, he decided with his corps commander not to use artillery on the area. He figured that would alienate the people in Palermo. It would be, if they took it peacefully, things would go much better. He was right. He occupies a palace, sleeps on about 3 mattresses every night, and he said that the chinaware had a Saxon symbol on it, and all of the servants gave him the Nazi salute, which he didn't dissuade them from for some reason. So that's a little element of Palermo for you. Okay, this is the 7th Army on the race to Messina, and this soldier is actually taking a picture of Patton as Patton's taking his picture. These are Italian prisoners, and Patton couldn't speak enough about, by the end of the campaign, how proud he was of the soldiers of the 7th Army. He said he would see them sitting, eating their lunch next to dead German bodies, that they were, the toughest army there is. Of course, this is after 2 slapping incidents because of soldiers that he felt were gold bricking. But at this point, with the capture of Messina, Patton is pretty much the grand military commander of the U.S. Army, of U.S. forces in the Mediterranean. The expectation for the Americans was not that high because of Kasserine Pass. The British and the Germans thought the Americans, were too soft and couldn't fight. And here Patton takes 2/3 of the island and captures the goal. So it's a real turnaround for the entire American military and the Allied cause. So I had mentioned he slapped 2 soldiers in 2 separate hospitals who he thought were gold bricking. They were actually suffering post-traumatic stress. This is incredibly damaging to Patton's career. He had really been at the pinnacle at one moment, and now nobody kind of wants him. He lives in isolation in Sicily while the war continues in Italy. And on his next birthday, November 11th, 1943, he visits a cemetery for the 2nd Armored Division. And he wrote about this incident going and saying a prayer there. He said, "A year ago, I commanded an entire corps. Now I command little more than my self-respect." And so that's kind of how far he has sunk. Next. All right, now these next 3 photographs, I think, are some of the most interesting that Patton took. While he's in isolation, while he's in this depression, he decides to go to Italy and visit the front. This is going to be January of 1944, early January. So he goes to the front and he visits Jeffrey Keyes, who's now the commander of 2nd Corps, who had served under Patton as something called a Provisional Corps commander. And Keyes takes him for a tour of the front. Next photo. So they're walking along this ridge here, and Patton turns to his right, and he sees, and it's very hard to distinguish, but he sees artillery guns dug in and firing, and you can see kind of the smoke here. By the way, these splotchy marks way up top, that's the glue holding the pictures into the photo albums. But he was really focused on these artillery guns, so he stopped, took out his camera, and took a photo. And as he does this, an artillery barrage lands 30 feet in front of him. Codman, one of his aides, got a piece of metal in his helmet. Patton said the nose of a shell came within inches of his foot. And he said, this photograph right here saved my life, because if I hadn't stopped to take it, next picture, he would have been right here. And you can see the damage the artillery shell did. So Patton sees this as a sign from God that he is destined for greater things. So here he is feeling lower than low, and an incident like this happens, which might make some of us retreat, but Patton sees this as a sign that he is destined for greater things. And within weeks, he's called to London, told he's going to command 3rd Army, and his career will go further from there, although it's going to hit a few road bumps on the way. So when Patton gets to England, he decides he needs some companionship. He buys a dog named Punch that had belonged to an RAF fighter pilot. Patton renames him Willie, and remember this part. He names him after a song called Wee Willie Winkle, an old Scottish nursery song. Not William the Conqueror, okay? That's a movie where they talk about that. But he loved Willie. Very well-trained dog. I believe in the movie he's portrayed as a coward. The only thing I've ever seen that would even hint at a cowardice is during an artillery barrage, Willie hid underneath a chair. Cowardice, smarts, you make your own mind up. But he said that Willie would always climb into bed with him, that he knew when to get up, he knew to make certain noises when he was hungry. And speaking to Willie's courage, sometime in November in Europe, Eisenhower comes for a meeting and brings his dog Telek, and the 2 dogs get into a fight, and the staffers have to break them up, and it's decided that since the Eisenhower's dog outranks Willie, that Willie has to be pulled out of the room. And so they put Willie in a closet, and they said he was whining through the whole meeting. But Patton turned to Eisenhower and said, "My dog kicked us, not out of your dog." So next picture. Real quick with Willie again. People always like this story. Go back one picture. I get 3 questions about Patton all the time. Is the movie accurate? Did he really have an affair with his niece? And when did Willie die? And I've talked to members of the Patton family. I've talked to everybody I could. I have not been able to figure it out. But I can tell you that when Patton was killed from his car accident, they brought Willie home, and with him was a bust of Hitler, and the family didn't know why. And what they came to find out was Patton had trained Willie to pee on the bust of Hitler, so they put the bust out in the backyard, and that's where Willie would relieve himself. Next photo. Now this picture, I was very surprised that this was in Patton's photo albums. This is a soldier sort of meet and greet area in Knutsford, and if you know the story, This is where Patton gives a speech, and before and after every speech he said, I was never here, you didn't see me. But he talks about how in the future the Russians, the British, and the Americans are going to rule the world. And a British newspaper, of one of three, publishes the speech and leaves out the word Russians. Causes a big hullabaloo, to use it cleanly. But the real problem that Eisenhower had with this is that Patton was on record speaking. It was supposed to be secret he was in the area. They were building up a big show for the Germans that Patton was going to lead an invasion of Calais and would take the German eye off of Normandy, where the real invasion was coming. And so Eisenhower is furious about this and almost sends Patton home. Martin Blumenson had started some research that I've continued a bit on, and his theory was that the British deliberately outed Patton so the Germans would know he was in the London area, that he was leading this invasion. And days after this speech, British intelligence did pick up German communications, that they acknowledged that Patton was in the area. So it's very possible that a miscommunication or something that was secret sent Patton almost home for something he really was not guilty of. So Patton's going to get to Normandy, to the fighting, exactly 1 month after D-Day, July 6, 1944. He's basically going to sit and wait until August 1st, when there's enough troops arriving and there's enough room to get his Third Army activated on the run. So during this downtime, he takes a number of flights around the area, and that's actually Omar Bradley's plane. Patton took this photograph from his. And actually, at one point, Patton flew over enemy lines. And his pilot, they found a railroad track and followed that back to the American lines. And, Patton said, God, if Eisenhower ever found out about this, I'd be sent home so fast. So that was another big, he was always worried about being sent home. It was a big anxiety of Patton's. So there's the breakout of Avranches, August 1st, Third Army goes on the offensive, racing across France. This picture to me is one of the best examples of what a frontline general Patton is. He talked about this observation post. I believe this is the 90th Infantry Division. He climbs into the trench and watches a tank battle between the Americans and the Germans. He's so close, he can hear the different rates of fire between the German and the American machine guns. So that's an Army commander basically right on the front line. And this is not an isolated incident. I've discovered a ton of scenarios where he would visit observation posts, come under fire. One of them he went running away because the Germans saw the stars on him. And I could say, well, you could criticize him for running, but he was there. He was up front, And he would actually develop this habit where he would drive to the front and then either fly back to his headquarters or put a blanket over him, because he always wanted his men to see him moving forward, never back. This, I think, it shows you the sense of humor Patton had. And he had a very sharp sense of humor. This was in October. Marshall came to visit. And I don't know if someone on Patton's staff did that or if he did it himself. But, reading his diaries, he visits Jerusalem, and he talks about visiting all these holy places with Secret Service men guarding him. And he goes, what's the matter with them, lack of faith? And he visits a church, or almost looks like a mosque, where Jesus ascended to heaven. And he, wrote about it very reverently, and then he said, a hell of a note. So, that was Patton. He had a good sense of humor in person and in his diaries and letters. Next birthday, November 11th, 1944. Patton said, I got up to the front where the bodies were still warm, like we'd all want to do on our birthdays. I believe this is a place called Petit Hatonge. The Germans had launched an attack. This is after crossing the Moselle River. And you can actually see Patton's shadow here. He's taking the photograph. And an infantry regiment was hit by the Germans. They called in some tank destroyers and halted this German counterattack. And Patton said that was the most bodies he had ever seen of dead Germans. And I've gone to this place a number of times, right, when I give tours. And I actually went with the regimental commander's son. And I said, Ray, where was this German assault vehicle that led the attack? He goes, well, it's about 400 yards up this road. So I actually went up the road, turned left, and kind of recognized a lot of this terrain. So I think I actually found the exact spot that Patton took this picture. This is a very interesting photograph. Patton sends this to his wife after the Battle of the Bulge. And he says, I crossed the Sur River, the only natural barrier between my troops and Bastogne, stepping across dead bodies along the way. Now, if you look at this picture, this is not winter. If you look closely, these are not helmets, but helmet liners. And it's definitely, if not peacetime, it looks like this was taken back in the United States. And what I found out, there was this rumor, myth, whatever you want to call it, that Patton swam a river during the Battle of the Bulge. This was an AP story that came out in January, I think maybe actually early February. And the soldier said, he swam the Rhine River, and I saw it. This guy was in the 4th Infantry Division. And so a lot of soldiers said, this was a mythical story, that, he was driving across a fjord, and that's why people thought he was swimming. Well, I actually found 2 other firsthand accounts. One was in Patton's scrapbook, the other one was in the Library of Congress Veterans Collection. And they said what happened was Patton rolled up on this area near a town called Bettendorf, and he saw the engineers, and he said, okay, build the bridge, whatever. And the engineers came to him and said, we can't, sir. The enemy is shelling us too heavily. And 2 eyewitness accounts remembered exactly the same. He took off his coat, his belt with the pistols, stripped down to his underwear, swam the river with ice flowing in it, swam back, 64 years old, by the way, and got out of the water, turned to the engineer and said, I'm sorry, what's the problem? And boy, they built that bridge. From my research, this either happened on January 18th or 22nd. I actually found the 4th Infantry Division's records at the archives. They built 2 bridges, but the way they described the terrain, I was able to find the general area. So I think he didn't want his wife to worry. So he sent her this photograph, no mention of swimming any rivers. Bob Hope heard about this, and he said that West Point was now putting ice cubes in the pool for the cadets to swim to train to be like Patton. This one was taken on January 22nd, of a dead German, and that's Patton's finger in the lens. We've all done that, I'm sure, once or twice before cell phones. And like all of us, he wrote home to his wife saying how much he regretted that he didn't have his color camera, because the German's face was such an interesting pale claret color, just like all of us would want to do, right? So this is really blood and guts Patton, and another time of real kind of glory for him, because by January 22nd, he's linked up with the troops in Bastogne, and he's working to close. Actually, the bulge has already been closed off, technically, in a place called Houffalize, and the troops are starting to drive east again. Patton said this was the worst destruction he saw during the war. The war is starting to wind down. They're deep into Germany. And what happened was a German column was retreating down this road when a column, I believe it was the 12th Armored Division, caught up and basically just turned their turrets to the side and blew the Germans off the side of the road. This destruction went on for about 4 miles. Patton said it was, like I said, it was the worst he'd ever seen. He said there were no bodies, though. The area had already been cleaned, but he felt really bad that there were a lot of dead horses. Patton was a cavalryman and a lifelong lover of horses, and that really upset him about what he saw. Okay, I'm sure a lot of you might know what this is. This is the Rhine River. Patton promised that if he ever crossed it, he would christen it. And so this is one of actually 2 photographs. This one, he gave his camera to Charles Codman, his assistant, and he took this nice, clean, family presentable photograph. Patton then dropped his fly and christened the Rhine like he promised, and he said it was the pause that refreshes. And there is a photograph of him in action, and in the frame you can actually see Codman walking away holding the camera, having just taken this photo. That photo was never sent to his wife. This one was. An interesting side story, once he did it, he got back in his command car, drove onto the other side, got out, and pretended or deliberately fell down and came up with 2 fists of dirt. And he said, hence William the Conqueror. And William the Conqueror, when he went to invade England, actually fell out of his boat and came up with 2 handfuls of sand and said, thus I have taken England with both hands. And so I think that shows the 2 sides of Patton, the sort of vulgar guy and the historian Renaissance man on the other side of the shore. So that's Patton crossing the Rhine. We had talked about John Waters. As Patton got close to the prison where John was kept, he was given orders that Third Army was to start heading north. They were going to miss it. So he launches a very ill thought of raid to a place called Regensburg, where the POW camp is. A little bit larger than a battalion, mostly tanks, jeeps, and trucks to haul these POWs out of there. He actually takes one of his assistants and puts him in a jeep, assistant that knew what John Waters looked like. And it was a disaster. They reached the camp. John comes out to help with the surrender of the camp, gets shot in the buttocks, so he has to be brought to the hospital. The Germans then surround the Americans in the camp because they knew where they were going. They could see him coming. They actually took a German officer and propped him on the first tank and said, give us directions to the camp. And then when they realized where it was, they threw him off. He went into a house and made a phone call, said, this is where they're going. It's probably Patton's worst military decision. He does a lot of personal stuff wrong, but this was his really only and major military mistake. John does survive. 7th Army is going to rescue him. Patton has him flown to a hospital in Frankfurt, and you can see he looks kind of gaunt. But Patton said he had a good appetite. He was eating potato soup. I actually interviewed the commander of the raid, and I said, did you think it was to get Patton's son-in-law or to rescue the POWs? And he said, I pondered it a long time. I think it really was to get the POWs. And I said, well, there's one thing that bothers me. Why didn't Patton call for any air support? And he goes, well, I guess because we were moving so fast it wouldn't have made a difference. And I said, yeah, but they could have intercepted the Germans on the way when you guys settled down in the camp for the night to head out the next day. And he goes, maybe you're right. So that to me is evidence that it really was to get John. Side note on this, so John Waters is going to later become a 4-star general in the American Army. He's going to be head of an old command named CONUS, Continental United States. But his wife Beatrice, Patton's daughter, dies in 1952. And Patton's wife goes to the house to clean it out and everything, and she just finds liquor bottle after liquor bottle behind, furniture, underneath the bed. No one knew she was a closet alcoholic. And, whenever I give this talk, we always talk about the effect of war on soldiers, but it's really like throwing a rock in a pond. That effect has a much broad one, and I think that the war caused her to be an alcoholic. And so that's sort of one of those added dimensions of war that sometimes you don't consider. Patton is going to reach a town called Moosburg and liberate the camp here. It's a double-edged sword for him in his heart because, the men just adore him. They say, we've seen the face of God when they meet him. They all want to touch him. To them, he's the personification of their liberation. He gets up and gives a speech, and he says, don't try to eat anything, because your bodies haven't adjusted to it. We're going to get you home within a month, and he kept his word. And then he said, and one last thing, stay out of my way because I'm still killing Germans. And they went bonkers. They loved that. But he was very upset later because he said, if I had been a better general, a lot of these guys wouldn't be here. Side note on research and the things you discover before you publish and after. About a few months after this book came out, I got a letter and a call from a guy. He sent me pictures. And he said, I was this guy. I specifically remember Patton coming into camp, and the first person he shook hands with when his Jeep stopped was a British RAF officer. And if you look closely, that is not an American hat, that is a British hat. And so I was like, well, I'm not going to question you. And they said it was 2 Jeeps and a tank. So I'm thinking this is the tank with the celebratory POWs celebrating their victory, their liberation. This is Berlin, the Reichstag, if you want to know what Patton's handwriting looks like. It's actually pretty good here. It's usually pretty awful. He was a dyslexic, and it showed. This is where Patton really kind of starts making the turn, where he starts saying, we attacked the wrong people. We destroyed a civilization, and now these what did he call them? Bolsheviks are taking over, these savages. He said Berlin was basically wiped off the face of the earth, in his opinion. In the movie, and a lot of people say, well, Patton, he wanted to go to war with the Russians. And to that I say yes, but a lot of American generals wanted to go to war with Russia as soon as the war was over. In his collection, he has a photograph of him and a Russian general, and he puts the quote, we have found the enemy and he is Russian. And he goes, I didn't say it, Walton Walker, one of my corps commanders, did. So, in reading this, you really get a sense it was a pretty well spread out philosophy. Patton was no lone wolf on this idea. This is the last photograph Patton took. When the war ended, he went up to Stockholm, Sweden. He toured all over Europe. And in 1912, he had actually been in the Olympics, a sport called the modern pentathlon, which was, I can see if I can always remember these, shooting, swimming, sword fighting, steeplechase, and running. And Patton came in 5th. And one of the reasons was during the pistol shoot, he missed the target twice. Now there's Patton fans that like to say that the bullets went through the same hole as the previous one, but the judges in Sweden didn't know about his legend, so they treated him like a regular human being. He actually met up with some of the Olympic contestants that he had been with, and they had a pistol shoot, and he won in 1945. So in 1945, Patton won the 1912 Olympics. The Swedish military puts on a motorcycle show for him. This is a precision motorcycle team. And so Patton whips out his camera and takes this picture. 9 days later, he's going to be in Mannheim, and that's going to be a car accident that's going to take his life away in about 10 days after that. And we know this is the last photograph because it's on the last page of the albums. Beatrice wrote, "This is the last picture my husband took." The camera was sent home to the United States when she developed the film. So I always like to conclude, that so Patton raced across all of Europe. A lot of those landmarks still stand, like this castle, and this is in Laval. And so if you were to ever travel to any of these areas and you've seen these pictures, next, you can stand in the footsteps of Patton. So with that, are there any, how are we doing on time? Did I go too much? Yes, sir.
You talked about the plane, I think, in Regensburg.
Yes, sir.
And you said, you asked why didn't they provide air support, and the fact that they didn't provide air support indicated that the motive may well have been to rescue the son-in-law, John White.
Yes.
So I was just trying to follow the logic of that. Why would that indicate that why would the lack of air support indicate that the real motive was to get his son home?
Because if he was going to liberate prisoners, he would have used every tool in his toolbox. If he was trying to keep it secret because he was just getting his son-in-law and didn't want it to get out until it was over, you don't call in all your tools. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Task Force Baum was the name of the task force. And Captain Baum talked to me, I think it was 1998 or 99. Very nice gentleman. He's passed away since. Yes, sir.
What's your take on the conspiracy theory of Patton's death?
Just what you said, it's a conspiracy theory. There have been a number of conspiracy theories. The first one was put forth by French communists in the 1970s, that Patton had found the Nazi gold and was going to give it out, evenly distributed to all the people of Europe that the Germans had occupied. So Eisenhower had to have him knocked off. I think it was Don Wilson in Target Patton came up with the theory from an interview with an OSS agent that, let me get this straight, several OSS agents had been captured by the Russians. So Stalin made a deal with Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, who knew he was going to be out of a job when Harry Truman became president, because Truman didn't like the OSS, that the OSS would kill Patton in order to get these POWs back. I've been to the intersection where the accident happened. The theory is that he was shot with a rubber bullet or plastic bullet or something like that, and that paralyzed him. And so he was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg, and that's where they used poison gas. I have seen Patton's room record. There was a nurse with him 24 hours a day. So I don't know how he got the gas to move to one side of the room. I've seen his limousine at Fort Knox. He sits kind of far back. If it was a side shot, I don't know how they would have gotten him in the spine. The book sold really well. Conspiracy theories work real well. Brian Sobel, another historian, is the only person to have interviewed everyone in the car with Patton and the driver of the truck on the other side. They didn't hear any gun go off. They all said it was an accident. These theories, they never developed until later years, and always used for political purposes. To make Eisenhower look bad, to raise Patton up to sort of like almost like a godlike status, and there were those evil forces that took him down.
Someone's bigger than life.
Exactly. So, sorry if I burst anybody's bubble there. Yes, sir.
Why don't you discuss a little bit what you learned from the photos and your research about Eisenhower and Patton?
Eisenhower is not in a lot of the photographs. And that may have been that when Eisenhower visited, Patton wasn't doing his hobby. There are a number of photographs of them together. I actually interviewed a soldier who saw them out on the road and ran over and said, "Can I get a picture of the three of us?" And they said, "Sure." Took his picture, and he got both of them to sign it too eventually. All of the photographs of Eisenhower, I believe, in the collection are Army Signal Corps photographs. So he is in there, but nothing that Patton took. I can tell you from my own research, at least until D-Day, whenever Patton criticized Eisenhower, he would always put the caveat, but I can't think of anybody that could do the job he's doing better. You know, as much as he resented Eisenhower, and he resented Eisenhower's chief of staff even more because he was the hatchet guy, he always held that little bit, he said, but God, I wouldn't want his job and I couldn't do it. And he really was, as long as they were very good friends, but my research has shown that Patton was terrified of Eisenhower, that he was going to send him home from day one. And when he was isolated in Sicily, he drank like a fish worried about this. So friendship, but he had a very healthy fear of Eisenhower. Yes, sir?
Was that a Leica camera that Patton had?
Yes, it was a Leica camera. Leica cameras are actually German cameras. They actually, a lot of them were built in Sweden. Patton's, he actually had his initials in gold on the back of it. It said Fort Knox. You can see it today. And he actually had somebody on his staff build a little wooden contraption so he could rewind it faster. He said he had a color camera on him. I've only seen 2 color photographs. They were taken during downtime in Sicily. And if you watch the movie, there are only 2 scenes in the whole movie where he's got the Leica camera on. One is when he arrives in Tunisia and he's taking all his equipment off, talking to Bradley. And the other is the famous standing in the snow, talking about, God, I'm proud of those men. And you can see the camera hanging on him with Willie by his side. Yep. Yes, sir?
So I'd like to know, how accurate was the movie?
Gosh, I never get that question. It was actually very accurate. They had to make certain adjustments to present a lot of things. Like the example I always give, when he goes into Palermo, an aide comes up and shows him a note that says, you know, don't take Palermo. And he famously says, well, what do you want me to do? Give it back? That was actually Trier in Germany, where Omar Bradley said you can't take Trier with, you know, you need at least 5 divisions to take Trier. And he wrote back, I just took it with 2. What do you want me to do? Give it back. So things like that, but they actually got a lot of stuff right. The Willie thing, I actually saw the page in the script where it said, where the producer circled it, because they had Willie doing something. He said, no, Willie was a coward. And the producer was actually an assistant to Eisenhower during the war. I don't know that he ever met Patton, but he had a great affinity for him. But I have never seen that kind of evidence. I'll tell you real quick, there was a scene they took out of the movie that was in the script, because they sent the script to the Army for approval, and I found it in the Army files. There is a scene in North Africa where he comes, he starts getting everybody into shape, you know, getting the discipline around. He walks through a latrine, and he starts docking guys $5 and $10 for not having their helmets on. And one guy, you know, had his helmet on and saluted, and he said, now that's a real soldier. I don't know if that really happened, but that was in the movie. That would have been in the movie. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I see all your photos only from World War II. Patton, I believe, was in the Spanish-American War, World War I. I think he was actually a tank commander in World War I. Actually did a lot of diplomatic work between the 2 wars. How come the photos only document World War II? I guess that's question number 1. But I also thought that Pershing was his champion.
Yes.
For most of his years.
Yeah.
But you don't see any mention of Pershing, who was the chief of staff.
Chief of Staff had been the commander of the AEF, I'm sorry, American Expeditionary Force in World War I. All right, so the first question, okay, these photos, I think, well, yeah, he took a number of photographs all his life, and it was the Mexican War, not the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
And there are those photographs in the collection at the Library of Congress, but these were separate in photo albums, and they start the day the war starts. You know, he even posed for a manual on how to use the new sword, the Patton sword, and I found all those photos. So he has actually a very good collection of his whole life. But I think he realized the significance of World War II and everything, and boom, started these albums there. Pershing, Patton actually went to Pershing before the Pancho Villa expedition as a lieutenant and said, I want to come. And Pershing said, I got 1,000 lieutenants that want to come with this. Why should I pick you over anybody else? And he said, because I want it more than any of them. And that reminded Pershing of the way he got into the Spanish-American War, basically the same way. It really becomes, I wouldn't say father and son, but a great reference for Pershing. Patton's daughter actually starts dating Pershing. And she sees him and Patton off, Beatrice, Patton's wife, and Patton's sister, see Pershing and Patton off on the ship. And I followed the letters of Patton and Pershing writing back to her because she wanted to come to France and be with her man, you know, and support him. And he would write back to me, that's not right. You know, all these other guys are here without their wives and girlfriends. I shouldn't be afforded that. Patton was of the same like, writing those letters saying that, you know, it's a bad idea, you ought to stay where you are. What they weren't telling her was about Pershing's mistress that he had obtained over in France. And it really kind of made me feel bad for Patton, because I could see Pershing lying to her, but Patton's got to lie to his sister and say, don't come, for all these other reasons. And it's such a bad secret. There's actually a letter written by the chief of chaplains for the US Army in France saying, hey, everybody, stop talking about Pershing and his mistress. If it gets out, it's really bad. Not, you know, you're making up a bunch of stuff. It's like, let's try to tap this down, people. So it was a pretty open secret. Patton's sister, her name isn't coming, but she never married after that. She tried to rekindle with Pershing when he came back. But Patton always had an affinity for him before he left for North Africa. He visited him in Walter Reed Hospital, dropped to a knee and got his blessing, and turned and saluted Pershing right before he left. And he said when Pershing returned that salute, about 20 years dropped off of it, you know, that it really energized him. They had a bit of a correspondence, but after the slapping incident, it really dropped off. Martin Blummensen said that it ended, but I have seen some letters between the two. Patton sent him a saddle and other things that he collected along the way in Europe and in North Africa. And most of the stuff was written by an aide, but it dwindled, it did not stop, the correspondence. Yo.
Curious to where you think Patton might have ended up had he been in the German army.
Dead. He was very much a frontline soldier. Boy, in the German army, they probably would have thought he was a wuss. Germans were very strict. I guess he could have been Army or Army Group Commander. This is all speculation, you know. But with his age and his sort of appetite for war and discipline, I would say Army Group. I would hope he wouldn't end up in the bunker, you know. But somewhere along those lines. Interestingly enough, when the war is over and he loses 3rd Army and he's put in charge of 15th Army, which is really writing a history of the war, he had every opportunity to interview all of the high-ranking generals of the German army, and he never interviewed a single one. He interviewed 2 division commanders during the war. During the breakout in France, he interviewed a division commander. He actually respected him because he was regular German army, not SS. And then he interviewed an SS guy near Metz. And he said, you know, I got to wear high boots when I talk to these SS guys because all that they say. And he made sure that the bayonets were sharpened on the guards that were guarding him. And he threatened to turn him over to the French. And the SS guy just freaked out about that because he knew how much the French hated them. But boy, I never got that question before. Yes?
Where did you say this photo, the one you're showing here?
I believe it's Laval. I always get Laval, and where's the place where they have the big race? The Le Mans. Yeah, I always get, but it's in Laval. It's a very well-preserved castle. I actually had to get through a door I wasn't supposed to get to there to get this picture. But they give a lot of tours of schools and things like that. Yes, sir.
Is there anything that you came across that gave any indication, had he not died, what his ambitions were after the war?
Yeah, one of them was to turn his house into a museum. He wanted to add a wing to his house, and he wrote his wife extensively about this. They had a house in Hamilton, Massachusetts. He also had a yacht called the When and If I Ever Retire, which is still in use. I think it was last up in Annapolis. But nothing, he was very upset that the superintendent job at West Point had been taken, that the garrison commander or the leader of Fort Leavenworth, those positions had been taken by, of course, what he thought were lesser generals. So the jobs that he wanted were gone. And he really was, the day he had the car accident, he was going to be going home within that week. And he actually was going out on a hunting trip because he wanted to kill a peacock or something, because he wanted to get a plume for a hat he had gotten for his wife. So he was really ready to go home and retire and write his memoirs. Yes, sir.
Any insight, Patton's relationship with MacArthur? Did they have anything?
Well, they met each other in World War I.
Right.
They met on a hill outside of a place called Saint-Mihiel, a town called Pens. And, you know, he treated him with the proper military respect. And I don't know if you know the story. While they're standing there talking, an artillery barrage starts marching towards them. Everybody ducks except Lieutenant Colonel Patton and Colonel MacArthur. And Patton wrote in his diary the next day, I was the only soldier in the field besides MacArthur that never ducked a shell. There's no evidence of them meeting during the bonus march. They were both in D.C., but I researched it thoroughly. They never came across each other. When MacArthur wrote his really terrible memoirs, Reminiscences, where he is the leader of all, he talks about meeting Patton on the battlefield, and then Patton was very upset because his tanks were wallowing in the mud, but he put his arm around Patton and said, don't worry, someday these tanks of yours will rule the battlefield. It's amazing how prescient he was in 1918 when he wrote about this in 1966. There are a lot of mythical stories that came out of that meeting, that Patton flinched when an artillery barrage came by, when the first one, and MacArthur said, you never hear the one that gets you, don't worry. That was a made-up story and a biography of MacArthur that the same author, when he wrote a book on Pat, embellished on the story even more. And this author had never met either one of them. He was a writer of commercials. But for some reason, William Manchester took that story and put it in his MacArthur book, and it kind of kept the life going for a while. But it took me about 2 years to research and find it was all bunk. Yes, sir?
Back to the German Army.
Back to the German Army.
The movie made it seem like Patton was something of a legend to the German Army.
Mm-hmm.
Was that really true? Because I'm not a big scholar, but in my scant reading about the war, I didn't really see much commentary at all among German generals or Hitler about Patton.
Right. Definitely not early on, not in North Africa and Sicily, but it starts to build in France. There is a book out, I think it's called Fighting Patton, about the different generals that he fought, French and German, all through World War II. And the conclusion was he wasn't as a big a deal to the Germans. But I've talked to other historians that say the guy didn't do enough research. And actually, in Joseph Goebbels' diaries, he specifically makes reference to Patton several times. One soldier during the Battle for Mayenne, August 14th, 1944, breaks into a house where a bunch of Germans, they've got their guns over here and they're sitting here having lunch. And he says, hand a hoch, raise your hands. And they don't do anything. And in German, he says, I'm with Patton, and he has big tanks. And the Germans surrendered. So that's August of 44. So there was an awareness. They knew who Patton was. Yes, sir, in the way back.
You might have covered this already, but do you give any credibility to the theories, multiple theories of Bill O'Reilly against Facebook?
I'm sorry, who?
Bill O'Reilly.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was asked about the conspiracy, and that's all it is. Martin Dugert wrote that book, and Bill O'Reilly put his name on it. And Martin did an okay job, but basically used another book called Target Patton. And one of the faulty pieces of the research, I didn't mention this earlier, I think Dugert used this, where he said that the VIN number of the limousine in Fort Knox is not the same VIN number as Patton's limo, so therefore it's not the right car. Conspiracy. And so, of course, I immediately called down to the museum and talked to Chris Kolakowski and said, Chris, what's going on? He said, the guy was down here, and we told him, in the military, when a vehicle's in an accident, you chop off the part that's damaged, you put on a new one. And if anybody's been in the military here, I'm sure you know that story. And he said, and we told him this, that the back of the car is the actual vehicle, the front has been replaced. But he didn't want to put it in the book. The other conspiracy piece, the records are missing in the archives. If anyone in here has ever done any archival research, you will find documents missing. It's part of the process. No conspiracy there. The one thing I have not proven yet, he mentioned that Patton's plane was almost shot down by a Spitfire with Polish markings, and that in the research they never found this plane existed. It may have been a Soviet plane. I know if I call there's a museum north of London, an RAF museum, and I'm sure if I call them I'll get a different story. I just have never gotten around to it. I prefer to study the other parts of Patton's life, and it really was a car accident. So, yes?
So did you come across any pictures that he took with Omar Bradley or Montgomery?
Yes, Montgomery came and visited his headquarters in Sicily, in Palermo, and Patton's walking next to him. It's a picture of the two of them walking next to each other, and he calls himself Montgomery's personal bodyguard. They famously did not get along. What I did find in my research is the origin of this, that Montgomery actually put on a seminar in North Africa on how to fight the Germans. And the only Americans that went to it were Patton and Beadle Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. And Montgomery had a famous rule, no smoking in my headquarters. So Montgomery's up there speaking, and they're sitting there, and the speech goes on a while, like I'm doing, and Patton pulls out a cigarette from his case and starts tapping it, you know, puts it in his mouth, and Beadle Smith reaches over and pulls it away, and Patton's like, you're right. And so after the speech, Patton was talking to a British general, and he said, what did you think of the fact that you couldn't smoke in there? And he goes, well, you know, I might be old and stupid, but I'm nobody's fool, you know. And the rumor got back to Montgomery that someone said, what do you think of Montgomery's speech? And Patton said, well, I might be old, blind, and stupid, but it didn't mean anything. And so Montgomery took that as a real slight. So the origins of them not getting along really came from a misunderstanding and a miscommunication. He did have respect for Montgomery through Sicily, but it's really the breakout of France where Patton's blasting away a mile a minute, and Montgomery's kind of stuck, that he really turns on him. In fact, before the Normandy invasion, in England when they were planning, Patton specifically went to a tailor and had a uniform made and put all of his medals on it, because he said it always bothered Montgomery to see all the medals I had. And so he specifically always wore all of his medals just to tick off Montgomery. Bradley, the few pictures, he lost respect for Bradley, and Bradley lost respect for him, I believe in Sicily, when Montgomery kind of took over, pushed his forces west and took over part of Patton's line, and Patton led him, according to Bradley, and Patton said I was forced to because of Bradley, and then later said that Bradley didn't push his troops fast enough, which Bradley took as a real insult. However, I had mentioned the story about Dick Jensen's death. I think they both shared a secret there, and they kind of had that bond with Dick Jensen. One more question. There's got to be a good one.
During the two wars, Eisenhower went to work for Patton in Fort Meade. When did Patton actually meet Eisenhower?
That would have been at Fort Meade. I think it was Camp Colt. And their wives got along very well. They were both, young soldiers, had been promoted and demoted down to captain because of the cycling down after the war. And I saw this one story and I was like, really? That can't be true. They used to go out, now, according to this story, you can punch any holes in it you want, but they would go out at night driving in cars with shotguns looking for homeless guys. Not the Eisenhower we picture today, but I don't know if they found any, I hope not. But Mimi was a terrible cook. Beatrice taught her how to cook. There's a story, I think it was David Eisenhower caught a fish and brought it into the house. I think he stayed outside too long with it and brought it to his mother to cook. And I think Beatrice went and caught a different fish and cooked it for him and said, here you go. But Beatrice really taught Mimi how to cook. And they corresponded all the way through the war. They considered each other very good friends. Eisenhower wanted to work for Patton. He was under MacArthur out in the Philippines and was writing George, hey, I heard you've taken command of a brigade of armor. Please, bring me on board. But, history would prove otherwise. All right, that was the last one, I promised.
Would you take questions afterwards?
Sure.
If anyone has.
Well, I don't know, sir, can I take questions? Is that all right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I've got to check with the bosses.
Talk a little bit about Pattons Photo.
So if you want, people want
Oh,
to come up afterwards
sure.
and ask additional questions. But thank you all for coming.
And as you head out, I'm going to talk about Patton's faith. Patton was baptized a Catholic, actually. When he was born, they thought he was going to die as a baby. And so they had an Irish nurse who baptized him. But he was raised Protestant. He had mostly Catholic chaplains in Third Army because he thought that they were better than any other chaplains he had heard. Unfortunately, he did not allow for rabbis or Jewish chaplains in Third Army. It became such a problem that other division commanders were asking other Army commanders to send Jewish chaplains over, but when they did, Patton would have MPs pull them over and fine them if the chaplain was driving the Jeep and not a chaplain assistant. It got to be such a problem that General Haleslip, the 15th Corps commander from 7th Army, called George and chewed him out. And he said, you either let him in, or we're not going to provide you any, and he backed off. But always carried a Bible with him, very big about Sunday church. When he was in England before the invasion, his mansion actually had, the place where he stayed had a church, and he went there every Sunday. Okay. Now people can come up and ask me.